So this got rejected 54 times before it eventually got published. Now I've read this book and I'm like, that's a joke, right? That's gotta be a joke. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name is Mel and I like to review books. So I had a reading prompt for this week where I decided I was going to read some of the shortlisted books from the Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist for this year. So about a week and a half ago, we did have the winner announced and Virginia Evans won with her book, The Correspondent. So I had not read this yet, so this seemed like the perfect opportunity to get into this one. But also for my birthday this year, I had received Flashlight by Susan Choi, which was also on this year's shortlist. So I decided to also include this one in this week's reads. And then I just needed one more because I normally get through about 3 books a week. Just to have like a whole week where I was reading the Women's Prize for Fiction books. So the one that most appealed to me as I was looking at it was Marcia Hutchinson's The Mercy Step. So I did put a post about this earlier on, I think sometime last week when I'd actually started to read this because I was really into it. But we'll go into a proper review of this today. So obviously there were 6 books on the shortlist. So what I haven't read Dominion, I haven't read Kingfisher, and I haven't read Heart the Lover by Lily King. So I just put those 3 up on the screen. So those 3 I've not actually read. So when I'm going to do these reviews, I'm going to obviously review these books by themselves, but then I'm also going to talk about, out of these, how would I rank these 3? And do I think that I would actually rate The Correspondent as the best one out of the 3? Now, obviously, I haven't got the other 3. I don't even have them on my shelves, so I'm not going to be able to read all 6 and then do a comparison of all 6. But not to worry, I'm sure there's plenty of other people that have done reviews of all of the books that are on the short list. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the one that I actually started my reading week with, which was The Mercy Step by Marcia Hutchinson. So this one appealed to me because this one is set in the 1960s in Bradford, which is in the north of England. And in 1962, we have the birth of Marcy Hanson. Mercy Hanson, even. We have the birth of Mercy Hanson, and she at the time is one of 3 siblings which are in the UK, but her parents actually have another 4 siblings that live back in Jamaica. And then very shortly, Mercy is joined by another 2 younger siblings. So in the end, she is one of 5 that are living in the UK and one of 9 overall to her parents. And her parents are basically first generation immigrants come over from Jamaica after the war. So I guess you would call them the Windrush generation. And this book starts where Mercy is about to come out of the womb. So she doesn't have a childish voice in that sense. She obviously has a very mature voice as she's sort of narrating where she is and then how she feels about the fact that she's being born and then just after she's been born. But then this story goes on to narrate from Mercy's point of view how she feels as she's growing up. And it goes up, I think, until she's about, I want to say, age 12. So she doesn't fully reach adulthood, but we definitely get the first 12 years of her life. And this is obviously going to look into things about, what it's like to be, from her perspective, I guess, a second generation immigrant in this country, but also living in crowded housing when you've got about 4 or 5 people living in one bed, when you're in neighborhoods that don't particularly want a black family in that neighborhood. And also the problems that her mother faced at a time when her mother was without her father, being a single woman, at that time when women did not exactly have all the rights, to own a house or have their own finances and things like that. So I thought that this was a really fascinating book, and I can't really say too much about Mercy's life because otherwise this is going to give the story away, but there was some really poignant bits in this book and some really sad parts as well. Like, I think, like, as I was reading this book, I didn't really know whether to laugh or cry at some bits because she's telling you about really devastating things that would be happening to anybody, let alone a small child, but the sense of humor that it's told with is really good. um there's a lot of gallows humour in here. And Mercy is an incredibly intelligent little girl as well. And we can tell this, when she's talking about her contemporaries and also her brothers and sisters. And along with this, I would say that there was a lot of stuff in here that even I could relate to, despite not being, an immigrant in this country or a second generation immigrant or anything like that. And obviously I have white skin, I don't have black skin, so I don't have to worry about all of those things about fitting in or any language barriers or things like that. But just the way that this is written, like Mercy's experience as a child, like just going, like navigating some of the issues in her life, that would not be related to those other things. I could really identify with some of the things that she was talking about in this book. And I just felt it was so beautifully done. I'm never really sure what I think when I sort of read things that are narrated from the child's point of view, but I think what really saved this is, like, because it's not immature like you'd obviously expect if you were going to narrate something from a 5-year-old's point of view. It is an adult voice that they sort of put in Mercy's head. So it's almost like while Mercy is moving through her life between ages of just being born to 12, really you could say maybe this is an adult Mercy narrating herself back at that point. And it did kind of remind me a little bit like Demon Copperhead, that Barbara Kingsolver wrote, because obviously we kind of are, the book is being narrated from Demon's point of view when he's a child, but that's also at the point where he's being born into the world. And I really, really enjoyed that book and gave that a 5-star, and I thought that was really well done. But this one is also like absolutely super, really, really well done. Can definitely see why this was on the shortlist. I don't think I've seen anybody really talking about this yet. What really surprised me about this book is I watched an interview with Marcia Hutchinson about this book, because this is her debut novel. And she said that this was rejected from publishers 54 times. And I'm finding that really, really hard to understand, because this was absolutely spot on. I absolutely devoured this book. I couldn't wait every evening that I was coming to read this book to come and find out what was happening next in Mercy's life. And I really, really liked Mercy as a character. And I also think that, if I was a child of Mercy's age, I would have found Mercy funny and, insightful, and I probably would have wanted to be friends with her. I thought this was a fantastic book. So yeah, I think in the interview, Marcia Hutchinson said one of the problems that she may have had selling this book was a bit race related, because a lot of the publishers who were turning her down were white middle class women, and they just simply couldn't identify with the experience in this book. Now, I would say myself, like, I am a white middle class woman, and to be honest, reading this book, there was stuff in here that I could identify with absolutely fine, but it doesn't really matter to me that I couldn't, if I can't identify with the cultural aspects of a character, I will still literally go into a book to try and learn something, to see if there's anything in there, that I can pick up on and learn. So that's really sad if that's the reason why this book was not getting published, because I just think this was absolutely superb. I really hope that Marcia Hutchinson writes some more things. I can't wait to read them, honestly. Absolutely 5 out of 5, definitely giving this a 5-star, absolutely loved it. And this really got me excited to read the rest of the books that I was actually doing for the challenge this week. So yeah, this is definitely a 5-star. So the next book I decided to go on to was Flashlight by Susan Choi. So this is the biggest of the three. The Mercy Step, I think, is just over 300 pages. The Correspondent is just under 300 pages. And this one is just over 500 pages. So I'm not afraid of a big book, and I've said that before. I'm quite happy to read a really in-depth story and get lost in the characters for 500 pages. But what I will say is I do think that this did not need to be 500 pages, would be my first criticism of it. But we'll get into that in a bit. So this is a really intricate book about the history of the North-South Korean divide, really. So we have, what I would say, we've got like 3 main characters sort of make up this family. We have Cirque, who is the father, we have Anne, who is the mother, and we have Louisa, is the daughter. And Cirque was born in Japan during the time, well, I guess it would have been in about the 1930s or 1940s, I think, roughly around about that time. And he's going to school. Actually, yeah, I think he was born in the late 1930s. So in the early 1940s, he's going to school in Japan. And he has absolutely no idea that he has any Korean heritage at all. He was born in Japan, so he goes to a Japanese school, and he's being taught to fight towards the war effort. So he goes to Japan and he's going to school in Japan and he's learning to speak Japanese with all the other children. And in between their lessons, they have like fighting lessons with bayonets, which is really quite severe considering he's only about 5 years old. But then the Americans and the Russians basically come in and they liberate. I'll put that in quotes because I guess that depends on how you feel about that. But essentially, we then have Korea get split into, so we have North and South Korea, and North Korea was made into a communist regime, which was supported by the Russians, and the South was supported by America, so took on a capitalist regime. So what Cirque learns at this point is that his parents were actually born in Korea. So therefore, after the war ends, he's not actually considered Japanese, even though he was born in Japan. He's sort of considered Korean, and he's never really spoken Korea before, never identified with the Korean language. And so there's a big discussion, whether or not that they should move back to North Korea, essentially, where they think that they should go. And there's a lot of propaganda at the time, which would indicate that they could go there. And actually, in Japan, they are treated quite suspiciously because of the Korean heritage that they have, that they might be communists infiltrating into Japan. So it's a really complicated start to the story and a start to Cirque's life. But essentially, this goes on for many, many, many decades. So if you imagine that we started off really in the 1940s, and this goes on until I think it's in the 1990s, this story eventually finishes. So Cirque obviously moves on with his life and he decides not to go to Korea. He decides that he doesn't really have any opportunities in Japan because of his Korean heritage. So he decides to go over to the USA. And that is where he meets his wife Anne, and that is when they have their daughter Louisa. So Anne is a white American, and Louisa is sort of resembling her father a little bit in the way that she looks, but she's also very tall and has some of her mother's characteristics as well. So, she has issues in her school in the USA, I think, in some parts because, she's not fully white. But then they also do go over to Japan at one point, and then the children there don't consider her Japanese either, because she's not fully looking like one or the other. So she has like this mixed heritage. So from the off, we can see that one of the themes in this story is about national identity and cultural identity for sure, as two of our characters kind of have to navigate this from early childhood up until the point where they're an adult. But the story effectively starts when Cirque goes missing. So basically, Louisa's father goes missing, and then there's the whole history we have to unravel about what has actually happened to him, and then as a consequence, also what's happened to his daughter after he's gone missing, and what has happened to his wife Anne. So there is a lot packed into this book, and first of all, I would say that it's quite brave. I think the subject matter going into this, discussing, the political borders and the political reactions of all of the world players involved in the split up of the North and South, well, of Korea into North and South, but also like how the Chinese dealt with people trying to defect over the border and escape, how the Japanese dealt with that, and how the Americans dealt with it. And this book doesn't really pull any punches. It is quite harsh on all of those countries and all of those regimes and what happened to all of those people that essentially found themselves stateless or were trying to escape from North Korea, for example, over the borders into other areas. So this does not pull any punches, and I think this is the first book I've ever read that's sort of really gone into that kind of territory. So from a historical fiction perspective, this is really, really good, and I learned some things. And there's actually a reading list in the back of this book where you can go on to read a bit more about the themes that this book talks about. So I thought that was really, really good. So for all of that, I would definitely praise Susan Choi for that, because I think that it's a really interesting subject that she has decided to write about. Now, where this book fell down, as I said before, is I do feel this was a little bit large for what it was. And that's because we have a really, really complicated story. And this story is told through the eyes of basically three people. We have Cirque and his perspective, we have Louisa and her perspective, and Anne and her perspective. The difficulty is all of these characters are completely unlikable. I think Louisa, the daughter, is possibly one of the most unlikable out of the three. There's really nothing redeeming about her. Yes, she has quite a few traumas in this book, but she's just not a likable character at all. I really dislike the way that she, treats her mother. The father, Cirque, also has some massive traumas to traverse in this book. Some terrible things happen to him too. But the way that he treats his wife, Anne, is just awful. And I feel that he and Louisa eventually, they're like a team bullying the mother, Anne. So, and I really find that hard to get on with. Now, the mother, Anne, I got to admit, like, I had problems with her too. She was a very meek character, and even before she met Cirque, it was quite obvious that she was pushed around quite easily by other people, and like, she wasn't really given that much respect by people, but she never really demanded it either. And it's only, at the very, very, very end where she actually bites, when one of them is trying to push her around and, tell her what to think, or how to be, or whatever. So I really wish that the Anne character could have a bit more, could have stood up for herself a little bit more, because she was just like a sponge when all these other characters were just picking on her. Didn't like that. My other issue is that Louisa is a very secretive character, I think, and so is Cirque, and they share those characteristics. And there's a lot of this backstory from Cirque that we don't really know very well. There's still more that we need to know, and Cirque does not appear in the book as much as Louisa or Anne, so there are long periods before his character turns up to tell his story, and it's almost like they try to use Anne to tell his story, but also to tell Louisa's story in some bits. But because Cirque and Louisa don't really seem to like Anne, it's difficult, because I felt like as a character she was a little bit too far removed from the two of them, despite being the mother and the spouse of these two characters. She just doesn't know an awful lot. So in her storyline that we're following, I feel there's a lot of pointless stuff being spoken about that is really irrelevant to do with the story, like, her relationships with other men, like what she's having for dinner, some cat that she ends up looking after. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there that, there's a point where you're going over about 100 pages and you're like, okay, is this going back to something? Does this lead to anything? So I do feel that was a bit of a dead weight in the book, and could have probably cut off about 100 pages out of this, to be honest, if that had been a bit tighter. With regards to Louisa's part of the story, again, Louisa was an interesting character, but what I felt difficult with her is her timeline jumped quite a bit, because obviously she was going from child to adult throughout these decades. And there are some things that are gone on and on and on and on about. And then there's other things that are really important in her life that are just sort of skipped over. So the fact that she got a divorce is just sort of skipped over and then mentioned in a conversation much, much later on in the book. And some various other things, like she has children and we only ever hear about her children a very little bit. So from Anne's perspective, it's kind of like how she feels that Louisa is raising her children, but from Louisa's point of view, we don't hear that much really, and you think, given that what has happened to Louisa and the identity issues that she's been trying to deal with, it would have been interesting to actually spend some time with Louisa to understand how that actually did affect her children and the way that she brought up her children. So again, we kind of missed out on that, because trying to hear it from Anne's perspective was hard, because Louisa didn't have much to do with Anne. I also felt at the end of the book, despite we've got all these complicated issues with borders when it comes to, immigration and passports and, you know, what nation Cirque should actually belong to. You know, this is all a really, really, really complicated matter. And, you know, this is never explained at the end of the book. I can't go too much into it, but essentially, without sort of telling you what happens in the plot line, but essentially, you know, some decision about, you know, where this man is actually from has to be made, and how that was got around from a legal perspective, again, was just brushed over. And given how complicated aspects of this book are, I felt like actually I would have liked to have understood that a bit better. So I feel with this book, I think I would give this a 3. No, I'd give this a 4, sorry. I would give this a 4 because I think that the storyline is really, really interesting. Really introduced to me something I didn't know too much about, and I still don't, but I really actually want to carry on and read some more of the reading matter that Susan Choi has pointed out in the back of this book. So that was really interesting, but I just thought all the characters were unlikable, and actually I didn't, despite the huge amount of, you know, pages in this book, I still didn't really know the characters that well by the end of the book, and I didn't, you know, I understood on the whole what had actually happened, you know, as an outsider looking in, as like, okay, this is actually what's happened to this man, but I didn't really understand how it affected properly all the members in this family, um, in the way that I'd have liked it to. You know, there was a lot of rambling about, yeah, other relationships and things like that, which really, there were so many things that could have been said about these 3 characters, that we just didn't need to know all of that bit. I felt like I wish she'd have just focused more on, you know, maybe the more complicated aspects of the book, like citizenship and, you know, how that identity crisis may have continued into Louisa's life and things like that. But yeah, I did really enjoy this book, and I would recommend this as a read, but those are just the reasons why I probably wouldn't give it a 5-star at the moment. I think my general feeling is this maybe could have just done with one last edit. Okay, so the final book that I read was The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. So after having 2 really, really, really good reads to start the week off on, with this being the winner, I was obviously really, really, really looking forward to this. And I've got to be honest, I've been watching this get some absolutely great reviews. Lots of people talking about it over, you know, the spring, since it was shortlisted. Lots of people have been getting hold of this book and reading it. So this book is about is it a septuagenarian, a lady in her 70s called Sybil, and basically we basically see her correspondence of what she is writing to her adopted brother, her son, her daughter, her neighbour down the road. I quite like that correspondence. And then there's a couple of other people she's corresponding with. So she's like, if she's sending off a letter of complaint to somebody, there's a dean at a university that she's sort of getting a bit irate with in some letters. And then there's also a DNA company that she's sort of writing to a customer service advisor who works at that company. And then occasionally we see the letters that are coming back in response to her letters. Interestingly, she does also write to a couple of authors as well. So she has her best friend who she writes to, and they discuss what books each of them are reading. And the books that Anne really, really likes, you actually see her writing letters to the authors of those books to tell them what she thought of her books as well. So I would say that she writes to Kazu Ishiguro about Never Let Me Go. And she does kind of drop a spoiler in there, I would say, for that book. So just be really careful if you were planning to watch if you were planning to read Never Let Me Go, because I do feel like part of the plot line does get dropped in with this book. I haven't read all of the books that she's spoken about to authors in her letters in this book, so I can't say too much if any of the others are spoilers, but there was a couple of books she mentioned that I had read, and I couldn't see any spoilers for that, but for that one I could. So I enjoy the fact that this book has been put together basically with correspondence, because it shows us a very interesting window into Sybil's career in the past, how she views her life now, her general health, and the relationships that she has with her own children, you know, what kind of friends she has, and what kind of things that she likes to do. And as I say, I particularly enjoyed the letters that she was sending to her neighbour. I thought that they were quite nice. But that's about it, really. And what I mean by that is, like, as I was reading this book, it was an easy read. It was a nice read. Sybil has one tragic event in her past that she's trying to come to terms with, which we can see, which is pretty awful. And she has like a health complaint that she's trying to come to terms with that's in her present, which is, also not great. But I would say that the health complaint that she's trying to deal with, we don't really learn too much about it. And we don't, to be honest, really fully understand from our main character, Sybil, how she truly feels about that health complaint that she's got. So it's kind of there, being surface spoken about in some of the letters that she's sending people, and her doctor, but we don't really know all the details of it. So I don't know if that, because this is in letter format, it's stopping us really getting to this is how she truly feels. But then the trauma that she's dealing with in the past, we do understand a little bit more about how she really feels about that. We do reveal a lot more of her character, I think, with regards to correspondence and that subject matter. But I just thought, this is a nice summer read. This is an easy read that you can take on holiday with you, but it didn't feel groundbreaking. Sorry, it didn't. And I feel that this is going to possibly be an unpopular opinion because so many people have liked this book, but I'm failing to understand how this, how should I put it, elderly, middle-class white woman's privileged upbringing and career is more, how should I put it? I just felt that these two books were trying to say a lot more. I really, really do. Like, this was just like, yeah, this is a nice read, but this is not an award-winning read to me. And I sort of, and this is where it might be unpopular, but I'm sort of going back to what I saw Marcia Hutchinson saying about the difficulty of selling this book, and with race potentially being an issue, and I can't help but feel that these two women, who are not white women, are trying to tell really complex stories about class and womanhood and motherhood, I think, in these books. And identity forms a large part of it, because obviously our character Mercy in here is, she's a second generation immigrant, in white Britain post-war, not the easiest place to be. And in here, obviously, we have Louisa, who again is, she's part American, part Korean, part Japanese, and there's a whole identity thing that she needs to deal with there. And it doesn't really get any easier whether she's in Japan or in America, like trying to come to terms with that. This is talking about a really, really complex history, and this is, talking about the history of Britain in a way, like going back to the Windrush generation, which has been quite a hot topic actually in the last few years. This feels like a very safe book. I think that's what I'm trying to say. This is a very safe book. We're not saying anything outwardly political in here. There's nothing too racy going on in here. There's nothing really with regards to identity that we have to worry about in here. And yeah, so I enjoyed this read, but honestly, if I was going to score this book, I would give it about a 3.75. I don't think that it has the complexity and the depth that the other two books I read this week have, and I do in part wonder what provoked the Women's Prize for Fiction panel to actually pick this one as the winner, over the two that I've read. I don't obviously know about the other three that I haven't read, so yeah, I'm going to rate this one a 3.75. So I'm really interested to hear your comments, so please leave comments down below this video on how you feel about these books. If have you read all 6 of the books that were in the shortlist? Are you able to give me any idea if the other 3 are really worth a read, to try and do a ranking of all 6? Have you read The Mercy Step and Flashlight, as well as, the winner. How would you rank them all? How do you feel about basically what I've had to say in this video? So I've had a really good reading week because I do really enjoy reading women's prize for fiction books. And I'm not, I'm not disappointed. Okay, the winner is not maybe on the level that I would have expected, but this is still a good book. And quite frankly, I've enjoyed going through some of the shortlist and reading these two, and this is an absolute gem. So I really do recommend you pick up the Mercy Step and give that one a read because it's absolutely wonderful. So I will see you next week for my last prompt of the month, and you'll just have to wait till then to see what that is. If you've enjoyed this video, please press the thumbs up button, and if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye!